Today on the Melbourne Report, questioning the OPI, the Ombudsman steps up the pressure on phone tapping oversight and the Premier agrees. Fire safety, do you feel safer 3 years after Black Saturday? We ask you for your opinion. And safety at level crossings, another horrible accident, but can anything be done to stop more people from dying? On Sky News and the Melbourne Channel, the Melbourne Report begins now.
From the Sky News Melbourne studios in South Bank, this is the Melbourne Report with Ahron Young.
Hello and welcome to the program. Also today, taxis using tram lanes and more interesting ideas to fix the city's taxi problem. But first to this week's panel. The Herald Sun State political reporter Ashley Gardner, economist Professor Judith Sloan from Melbourne University, also David Imber from Essential Media Communications and Group. But we start today with the Ombudsman's report into the Office of Police Integrity. On the surface, the report itself hit the OPI with the full force of a feather. It couldn't answer the one question it set out to achieve: should the OPI have used phone tapping powers to investigate Sir Ken Jones? Yesterday, the government said the OPI's replacement will be monitored by a lawyer who represents the public's interest whenever it applies for a phone tap warrant. Of the 1,271 applications made by the OPI since 2007 and 8, every single one has been granted. But this will hurt the police force more than the OPI, and in a statement, Victoria Police tells us our internal processes for interrogating the evidential case for a warrant application is robust. Approximately 1 in every 4 applications for TI warrants is knocked back internally before progressing to court. Ash, I'll start with you. Should there now be more oversight when it comes to phone tapping?
Well, what has happened this week, this report has really exposed how deficient the OPI model was. It was a model that was set up in haste by the previous government that was just too gutless to actually set up a proper anti-corruption commission because they were pretty afraid of what the results might be.
And so what about this situation I'm quite interested in, where you have a state ombudsman who's now trying to investigate what essentially is a state organisation who is looking into the police force, but they are using Commonwealth powers when it comes to phone tapping. Does the Commonwealth Ombudsman ever get involved, and therefore, if they do not, does it therefore mean that the OPI is in fact above the law?
Well, I guess that question really just demonstrates what a damn mess this whole thing is, and let's hope that this new independent, broad-based anti-corruption commission that the Baillieu government is proposing will fix this.
Still more than 6 months overdue, and legislation's not even in the Parliament.
Well, let's hope they get it right, unlike what did happen previously, where it was this sort of, it developed just from a police ombudsman to an ombudsman to a deputy whatever. It just it really needs to be done properly.
Judith, I'll ask you on this, because if we listen to the OPI, we listen to Victoria Police, they're now coming out saying, trust us, you know, we've got lawyers in place, they make sure that they know what's going on, we push back a lot before they make it to court. Do you think that that is enough? Should we trust these organisations, or in fact, does every aspect of the law need to have someone arguing on the other side?
Look, I think it's very important to go back to the basic principle here, and that is that we should live in a society where phone tapping is sanctioned as little as possible. You know, I think that there has to be a strong onus of proof on those who seek to use phone tapping. So I understand that this looks like an additional layer of complexity, but I think actually we need to have these rights protected, and the idea that the OPI is using such extensive use of phone tapping, I must admit, actually as a private citizen, worries me quite a bit.
When you have a look at the numbers though, the OPI, I think in the past year has only done about 30 or 40 use, but Victoria Police uses it, I think, around 900 times over the past year. I mean, that's a huge difference. Do you think there also needs to be a bit more monitoring when it comes to Victoria Police?
Well, I just think we need generally very good safeguards in place, because I think, you know, the citizens really should have an expectation that, you know, there is free communication, untapped communication, and therefore it is only in extraordinary circumstances that such powers should be allowed.
David, what are your thoughts on the Ombudsman's report? Was there any point, given that it set out to, according to the media anyway at the time, it set out to try and determine whether or not phone tapping was necessary in the investigation of Sir Ken Jones? Was it necessary, and do you think it was a bit weak, the fact that the Ombudsman couldn't even look into that?
Look, I mean, I think what this exposed to me is that we do have a bit of a mess going on. I think maybe it's a cheap shot to blame the former government. I think they were seeking to bring in a regulatory regime that we hadn't had in Victoria, that we clearly needed to have. I think the focus needs to be, almost 1 year on what this government's promised to do. They said they were going to fix this problem. They wanted a Royal Commission, then they wanted a broad-based anti-corruption commission. We've got neither.
Well, I'll bring that back to Ash. Andrew McIntosh held a media conference yesterday. He's made some announcements. What happened there?
Well, he was asked on who would actually be briefing the public interest monitor, and he said that he would be. Now, that was something that he did correct within an hour. He had a press conference at 1 o'clock.
Very busy, probably.
He would be very busy. He had a press conference at 1 in which he said that, and by question time at 2, he'd changed that. The official explanation was that he did mishear the initial question.
Right, okay. Judith, do you think that...
Very charitable. Mishear the question as opposed to perhaps misunderstood his brief.
The question I have is that this is all theory, and obviously when it comes to the investigations, let's give them the benefit of the doubt that there is an incident where the police or the OPI needs to act with haste. Will the PIM, the PIM, slow down the process in the courts, given the fact that they're going to be able to bring witnesses in, they're going to be able to argue, they're going to need to read the affidavit? Surely, if they think that they need to use these emergency powers, it's because it needs to be done quickly.
I mean, I think Ash has got a good point that, and you know, I hadn't lived in Victoria for a long time, and I now do, and you know, successive governments actually seem to have made a meal of this. You know, there are some sort of best practice examples in the other states. And it seems to me that, you know, experimenting on the run is definitely not the way to go. So, you know, I mean, my guess is that you can have track A and track B in terms of, you know, permission to tap. And if, you know, you can demonstrate that it is high priority, then hopefully you could get a fast track. So, but, you know, let's not reinvent the wheel here in Victoria. Let's see how it works in other states and as much as possible, imitate best practice.
Okay, well, it's almost been 3 years since the terrible fires on Black Saturday, but this week we found out that Victoria's high-risk areas will go another season without the places of last resort fire shelters that were ordered by the Royal Commission. Now, it comes as the fire chiefs and Weather Bureau warn us it could be, in fact, a long, hot summer. So after all this time, do you feel safer in Victoria, and has the Baillieu government done anything to try and prevent a tragedy on the scale of Black Saturday? Judith, I'll start with you on this one. Do you feel safer, I guess, coming up to this bushfire season?
Thankfully, I don't live in a bushfire district, but look, I'm kind of interested in this from what I call a language point of view, that I always regarded the stay or go message as completely ambiguous. And dare I say it, it rather kind of attracted rather heroic efforts on the part of men, I think, that stay, you know, defend your property, or go. And so that's completely inadequate, you know. I understand there's been a little bit of progress in terms of that instructions, but seriously, I think, you know, if more people had gone 3 years ago, then we wouldn't have seen the death toll. So I think the thing is, we really have to have a more nuanced but readily understandable message, and the stay or go really didn't cut it.
You make a great point when it comes to stay or go. David, I'll ask this to you. The question I have is these refuges, and obviously they're very controversial, will they in fact install in people's minds that I don't need to go because there's going to be somewhere for me to go when it gets really bad?
Well, I think it's complicated. I think from what I understand, it is clear that both the former government, obviously the present government, have made it clear that there needed to be a change from stay or go. And it is quite clear, I heard Craig Lapsley on the news the other night talking about the fact that we're sending much clearer messages to people about leaving early. So I think those refuges are really need to be seen in that context. They're not what you plan for at the start of your bushfire plan, but if you, for some reason, have not heard the news, for some reason have got yourself stuck, then they are a last resort, and I think people will sadly know from Black Saturday, probably not the place you want to be.
Ash, is it going to be enough? Can you put enough of these refuges? Can you build enough for entire communities who may be thinking the same thing? I'll just wait until I hear it on the news.
Now, there are two different types of things we're talking about here. One is the neighbourhood safer place, which is basically just an area that might be a sports field or something like that. That's not going to protect you from getting burnt. That is just going to protect you from the radiant heat,
sure,
which is the biggest killer in a fire. And The second thing that was announced this week is the shelters that are going to be built eventually in these 52 or so high-risk areas.
But eventually seems to be the issue here, isn't it? Why does it take so long?
Well, the reason why it takes so long is that these things have to be sustainable for decades. They have to last for decades. In the wake of Ash Wednesday in 1983, a lot of shelters were actually built, but they became derelict pretty quickly because we forgot about them. These things have to be maintained for decades, and that's why I don't think there is. I think it is the smart thing to do this properly.
In the lead up to the election, we saw Ted Baillieu say that a coalition government would implement all of the 70-odd recommendations of the Bushfire Royal Commission. I'm going to move down the panel. I'll start with you, Ash. Do you think that it should happen that way, and do you think that they've made enough progress?
Well, progress is pretty slow, and quite rightly, they're being held to account for that. But I don't think we have the $100 billion or so to actually implement all of those recommendations. In the end, people need to take responsibility for their own safety.
And Judith?
Look, I think that's right. I mean, I think the notion that we'd underground all the power lines, the idea that we'd compulsorily acquire properties, which is problematic in itself because some people will not go. You know, I kind of, in some ways, regarded the Royal Commission report a bit like a coroner's report, this kind of rather extreme wish list.
Sure.
And the idea that you'd be implementing all of it was probably a very bad call by the government.
And David?
Look, I'm not going to pretend that I've read every recommendation of the Royal Commission, but I think it's clear that if you have a Royal Commission and then you don't really seek to take it seriously, or worse, you say in an election context you're going to take it seriously and they're not, is a concern. I'm not going to make this point a partisan point. There were clearly failures in the way that bushfire management happened that caused Black Saturday, and I think that those failures need to be rectified so that we never see that loss of life again.
Well, that's a panel's view. Thanks for that, guys. We wanted to know what you thought on this issue, so we sent Susan Wilson out with your say.
Since the Black Saturday bushfires, there's been no shortage of inquiries and investigations into what went wrong, who was to blame, and what needs to be done to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. But has there been enough action? Are we ready for the upcoming bushfire season? We hit the streets of Melbourne to find out what you think.
Wouldn't have a clue, but having been caught in the bushfires a couple of years ago, it was not pretty. There wasn't enough emergency evacuation stuff going on or pre-prepared, and it was all a bit of a hullabaloo.
Done enough to prepare for the upcoming bushfire season?
I have no idea. I've heard a lot of things going on in the news, but I don't know how much it affects the people who actually live in those areas.
I don't think so. There's not a great deal of public awareness about it, and I don't see that that people are terribly well. You know, there's no kind of great discussion about what needs to be done, or a discussion about vegetation clearing as well.
Have you heard much about it?
No, nothing at all.
I went for a tour up the Yarra Valley yesterday, and I thought to myself then, a lot of these shrubs and that are too close to the house. If anything blows up, you might put out the fire out the back, but the front's still on, coming through.
Yeah, no comment, not sure.
Been enough warnings around, I suppose, to telling everybody to get their fire plans and that in order, so...
Well, there you go. If you want to tell us what you think of that issue, you can email us at melbourne@skynews.com.au or tweet us at Melbourne Report. And don't forget, the Melbourne Report airs on Friday afternoons at 2:30 Eastern and is repeated across the weekend on the Sky News Melbourne channel. Just point your remote to channel 600. Still to come on the program today, another death at a level crossing, but what can be done to stop it from happening again? And don't miss our final thoughts segment. The Melbourne Report returns after this. And we are back. Welcome back. I'm Ahron Young. You're watching the Melbourne Report on Sky News. Joining me at the desk today, Herald Sun State political reporter Ashley Gardner, economist Professor Judith Sloan, and also David Imber with Essential Media Group. Well, on Tuesday, a 15-year-old, Teresa Ho, was killed at Jennifer Station after she was hit by a V-line train. She was walking across the tracks. The government has a plan to abolish 10 level crossings in Victoria, but it seems to be a drop in the ocean given how many crossings there actually are. We all remember Kerrang, so is there really a fail-safe solution? David, I'll start with you on this issue. Without being insensitive to what's happened this week, is there anything that can actually be done to try and stop future deaths?
Look, this is a very sad case, and clearly there's been an outpouring of emotion in the community over this, as you would expect. But there are a number of issues with level crossings. One of them is safety, the other is economic efficiency. There's a number of reasons why level crossings have really served their use-by date, but it seems that the problem is so insurmountable, to replace all level crossings is expensive. But I think we need to start with those that are most dangerous, those that are most in need for economic or other reasons to stop this, and maybe not start with level crossings in particular members of Parliament's electorates like Louise Ash's.
I'm going to get down to the Brighton level crossing soon, but Ash, I'll ask you this. This has been an issue which has been going on, I can't remember for how long. It came up again during Kerrang. There have been all sorts of issues over the past couple of years as well. Can anything be done? Should anything be done about this?
Well, just to illustrate how big the problem is, if we wanted to get rid of every level crossing in Melbourne, pay for it right now, we'd have to shut the government down for 10 months, basically, because it would cost around about...
Would we notice?
Well, that'd be no police, no ambulances, no schools, no hospitals, none of that.
Sure.
10 months, then you could get rid of every level crossing in Melbourne. That's why this is taking so long to do. But we are reaching a crunch stage where...
Should it have been done in the past? Is this something that has just... things get more expensive as time goes by?
Well, you just have a look at the eastern suburbs, for example, compared to the western suburbs, and the east has a lot more level crossings. That's I guess, been a political reality. But things have to be done, basically, because if you want to run trains to carry everyone who wants to catch a train on the Dandenong line, if you want to run enough trains for that, the level crossings would be down permanently during the peak.
Which isn't great for the other method that people get around, which is cars. Judith, I'll ask you, the government wants to spend $379 million on 10 level crossings, not the one at the Jennifer station where this accident happened. Is it a waste of money to spend this money? Do you think that that money could be spent somewhere else?
Absolutely not. I think particularly coming back to Melbourne, having grown up in Melbourne too, and living on the Glen Waverley line, it is absolute, the loss of productivity, the inefficiency associated with it. I felt very sad when that $16 billion was spent on school halls, when a lot of those schools didn't need new halls, because for Melbourne...
Some of them were sent on science centres as well.
Well, maybe, but... the point is that
so the argument you're making is about efficiency as opposed to safety. Is that something that we should...
It's both. But, you know, Ash makes the really good point. I was up at the tax forum and we were talking about a congestion tax, which would not be popular in Melbourne, I don't think. But let's say we had a congestion tax. The argument is that that would push people back onto public transport. That means the boom gates would be actually down even more. And so certainly in a local sense, we'd have more congestion. So, you know, this is such an economic dilemma as well as an issue of safety. I feel terrible about that young girl, and I'm not quite sure what happened, because in the level crossings that I'm familiar with, there's actually a sort of locking mechanism when the boom gates are down.
It is clear
it's not just a locking mechanism, but also I think that she was using her iPod at the time.
I totally agree.
So I'll push this onto you, David, and just quickly, because I want to also, before we move on to the next topic, talk about Brighton. Do you think that the advertising campaign that Yarra Trams has had in place in regards to 300 rhinoceros on wheels is the same as a tram? Be careful when you stand in front of it. Is that campaign working, given that people are still having these sorts of accidents?
Well, I know there are some allegations that, you know, to talk about behaviour change is to be a nanny. But the reality is people are using technology more. I have found that there are times when I've got an urgent work call when I'm crossing the road and I don't look as much. And occasionally I think, well, I need to take more caution to do that. So I've seen those signs from Yarra Trams, and I think they're an innovative way, you know, to help people and to make a difference to safety. I don't know if it's working. I would like to hope that it is.
And Ash, just quickly before we move on, New Street Brighton, is that something that needs to be jumped on urgently?
Well, that's the fact that is getting some kind of priority is a disgrace, and Terry Mulder and Louise Asher should be ashamed of themselves.
Okay, well, news this week that taxi drivers might be able to use tram lanes to whiz through traffic at peak hour. It's one of a number of proposals to fix the ailing industry that Professor Alan Fells, as he's trying to raise those industry standards. And then there's this idea to try and ban cars from parking on Beach Road at weekends to make way for cyclists. Judith, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that it would be safe for taxis to use those tram lanes?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that as a user, that taxi industry is in a bit of a pickle. I love getting.
It's the nicest way I've heard anyone describe the taxi industry
I like
for quite a while.
getting in a taxi in Melbourne and having to direct the taxi driver to where I need to go. I'm thinking, gosh, I thought that was his job, but so I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that the idea of them sort of in a perhaps cowboy fashion using the tram tracks is a bit of a worry, because then that might have knock-on effects in terms of the efficiency of the trams. I mean, all those years ago when I learned to drive in Melbourne, I remember my father saying, "Don't argue with the tram," and I think that was actually very good advice. Don't argue with the tram.
Ash, what are your thoughts? You used to be the transport reporter. I have this vision of those maxi cabs driving along the train tracks ahead of the trams and pulling up and saying, "Your tram's been cancelled, everyone jump in," and we'll go off.
Well, have you been to Collins Street lately? I think taxis use the tram tracks along Collins Street all the time. There is obviously a real problem with taxis in the city, and that's largely because a lot of the time the taxis are actually vacant and they have nothing to do at those low demand times. So obviously you can't find a taxi late on a Friday night, but the rest of the time they've got not much to do. So
they drive to the airport most of the time.
Well, yes.
David, your thoughts on the taxi industry? Is there anything else that you could maybe help out with Professor Alan Fells?
Look, I'm impressed to see Professor Fells looking at innovative approaches. We have had a taxi problem for some time. He's identified the fact that we pay drivers poorly, and I think it's clear that operators are getting too much. Why is a taxi licence cost $500,000? You know, there are clearly some problems in this industry, and I think that we need to see them addressed. I'm not sure driving on tram tracks is the way, but certainly to make sure there's more availability, particularly for those people with a disability who struggle to get maxi taxis still. I think, you know, there are some really important initiatives that Professor Fells is outlining.
Already we can feel the dead weight of vested interest slowing this process down. Should this be in the public interest or in the interest of the taxi industry? I think it should be in the public interest, and I hope Fells has got the guts to actually go through this, and Terry Mulder in the government as well.
Now, guys, there's also another great debate which is happening between cyclists and cars. It is not new. Beach Road is certainly a very contentious area. If only they could drive along the sand. We now have found out that the cyclists have won in this one. I think around 10,000 cyclists use that road each weekend. Ash, what are your thoughts? You're a cyclist.
I also wonder, I just posed the question, I wonder if these people, the cyclists on Beach Road, came from a different social demographic, whether action would have been taken. I think the fact that these are generally
they live around New Street, Brighton,
they're pretty,
is what you're saying.
exactly. They're pretty wealthy, well-connected males. I think that might have something to do with it.
Judith?
I mean, I just think it's a disgrace, actually. You know, because, you know, the motorists have rights. The motorists have rights to park. I can imagine families going down there with toddlers and the like, wanting to use the beach. I just think, and I mean, I thought part of the whole trouble about the Saturday morning rides was the hyper competitiveness of it. You know, that, and you know, hence we've had troubles and people running, cyclists running red lights and stuff. This seems to me just to encourage it. You know, the notion that, you know, that the cyclists are more important than the cars go away. You know, race on. You know.
David, just quickly, do you think that perhaps this is a sign that in that great debate across Melbourne about cars versus cyclists, that perhaps we're paying more attention now to what cyclists need?
Well, look, in a week where we had ride to work, and if I wouldn't have been homesick, I would have been riding my bike to work.
Great excuse.
Then we would have, I think we are seeing a bit of a tip here in terms of the greater prominence and popularity of cycling. I think what happens on Beach Road is a very specific sort of competitive hyper male executive cycling, but I think more broadly, sharing the road and sharing our public resources is a debate we need to continue to have.
Sharing the road is not actually banning parking, is it? I mean, I think
well, parking is one of the things that happens on a road. Other things happen on roads.
Yeah.
Well, it's obviously a contentious issue. You can write to us or tweet us, send an email to melbourne@skynews.com.au or tweet at Melbourne Report. Now it is time, though, for final thoughts. Okay, final thoughts. Ash, I'll start with you. The mystery today. Do you think Melbourne has a prostitution problem, and should police start policing the brothel industry?
There is an illegal prostitution problem. Yes, police should start that, start looking into it. Laws have gone into Parliament this week to do that. Hope it works.
Judith, should they start looking in, or will they be scared of what they find?
I'm very glad to say I wouldn't know. But look, I think the thing is you want to have a legitimate and regulated industry. That's preferable to the alternative.
And David?
I think it's clear that Consumer Affairs have failed in this area, as have local councils. There's clear evidence that we have sex trafficking in Australia and illegal prostitution, and I think that's a disgrace, and it should be a matter of priority, action rather than just words on this one.
And being at Essential Media Communications, I know that there's a lot of union talk that goes on there. We've seen a lot of strikes this week, particularly in the airline industry. What are your thoughts? Do you think the public is getting sick of these strikes?
Well, I think one person's strike is another person's fight for fair wages and conditions, and I think that's clearly the dispute that we're seeing at the moment. The public doesn't like strikes, but I think the public also understands that job security is something that's worth fighting for, and that's what unions do.
Judith, just quickly.
I think it's likely that the federal government will intervene. There are provisions under the Fair Work Act for them to bring this industrial action to an end, and I think that's what will happen next week.
At Ash?
In many cases, industrial action is forced by the way the system is set up. Perhaps there's a need for change there.
Okay, that is the program for this week. Thanks so much to this week's panel. We hope to see you again, guys. You can watch this episode of the program over the weekend on the Melbourne channel, as I've mentioned. We'll also have coverage of the Liberal Party State Conference from Bendigo on Channel 600 across the weekend. I'm Ahron Young. Have a great weekend.